All right, so we're going to take a look at your day-to-day questions, starting on question 101. So it's asking about Alaska. Why did people think that buying Alaska was a bad idea? So people thought that Alaska was just a large amount of useless land. All right, they called it Alaska's polar bear garden. They called it Seward's icebox, and this came from William H. Seward, who was a senator at the time, and he was a big expansionist. He believed in manifest destiny, and he really thought that buying Alaska was something that we needed to do. But people thought that he was crazy. They thought that this was just a waste of money, and there's no point in having all of this land. Obviously, we know now that there was a large amount of oil and gold in Alaska. It's an important space for us to have, especially with our military. Okay, so if you see Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, that's what they're talking about, the purchase of Alaska. What is yellow journalism and an example of it that started the Spanish-American War? So yellow journalism or the yellow press, sometimes you'll see, that's a type of journalism that doesn't report much real news with facts. It's just those shocking headlines, kind of that clickbait that's going to catch people's attention to sell more newspapers, or now you see get more clicks, right? So it involves exaggerating facts or spreading rumors. And you'll see this a lot now on the internet. You'll see a headline that when you click on it doesn't have anything to do with the actual story. All right. So the press convinced the American people that the Spanish sunk the main battleship off of the coast of Cuba, and that led to the U.S. declaring war on Spain. We don't really know exactly what sunk the Maine, but most historians think that it was actually some sort of internal issue, an explosion that happened internally in the ship, and that the Spanish really had nothing to do with it. But because of the way that it was presented in the media, it led to us declaring war on Spain. So obviously, this kind of yellow journalism isn't without risks. Obviously, it had a negative effect in this case. Why did the United States expand into Latin America? So the U.S. wanted to protect the economic interests that they had in and around Latin America from European interference. So when we start talking about the Panama Canal and things like that, these are the economic interests, the resources, the shipping routes that the United States wanted to protect, and it didn't want Europe or any European countries to get involved in that. All right, Roosevelt's policy in Latin America. That's going to be the Roosevelt Corollary. So that stated that should any Latin American nation engage in a chronic wrongdoing, a phrase that included large debts or civil unrest, the United States military would intervene. Okay, so essentially, this expands on the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had previously said that, you know, European nations need to stay out of Latin America. The Roosevelt Corollary expanded on that, said, yes, European nations still need to stay out of Latin America, but also if we see Latin American nations having large unrest, like a civil war or a coup where they try to take over the government, or some big economic or social problems, that the United States is going to get involved. They essentially acted as an international police force, and they're going to get involved in Latin America. What's the purpose of obtaining islands in the Pacific? So this is something we talked about the other day, that the United States needed to set up ports in the Pacific in order to be able to trade with China, and then we talked about the fact that they should have military bases in order to protect their interests in the area. So, especially if we're talking about like Midway and Hawaii, those are going to be huge, important ports that are used during World War II. It gives better access to Asia. So in World War II, we obviously were fighting against Japan, and without Hawaii and Midway, that really wouldn't have been possible. Some of these other places we also use for trade just gives us kind of a midway point where we don't need to worry about being so far away from these places where we might want to trade or we might have conflict in the future. All right, Roosevelt and big business. So he believed that the government had the right to regulate big business in order to protect its people. So he became known as a trust buster, and you'll see this in a lot of political cartoons. So he broke up unions and pushed for the passage of consumer protection acts. So essentially, he started with the railroads, and he said, you can't have this kind of monopoly. This is going to affect consumers. So he went through and he's breaking up all these trusts and monopolies. He basically believed in the opposite of a laissez-faire capitalist system. Okay, he didn't believe we should have hands off. The government should be fully involved. All right, the 17th Amendment. This is one that we don't talk about that often, but it's really important. So it called for the direct election of senators, each of whom would serve for 6 years, and this increased citizens' participation in the government. So when you look at this, you go, well, isn't this what we have today? Yeah, the 17th Amendment, it set up what we have today for electing senators. Before this, state legislatures were the people who put senators into power. So this gave the United States citizens much more control over their senators and who is in power. And this increased participation just gave the United States citizens a little bit more of a hands-on experience with the government. All right, so muckrakers. It's important to know that muckrakers are journalists who tried to create reform or change through their writing. So their goal is to write and not just have it be something that people read, but something that's going to affect how life happens and how the government takes care of certain businesses. So we have a few examples, and you need to pick 2 to write down here. And I want you to write a little bit about what they were talking about in their writing. So we have Jacob Riis, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, and you saw an excerpt of that on your last test. How the Other Half Lives was essentially about people living in poverty and how most people don't see what's going on in tenements where people are living in horrible conditions. They have illness. There's a lot of crime and violence. So that's what he featured in How the Other Half Lives. And so it gave people a chance to kind of see what was going on and possibly work towards making a change. Ida Tarbell wrote a history of Standard Oil. This was essentially an expose on John Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company, and showed a lot of the practices that were happening in the company that were maybe not legal or would be frowned upon. Okay, so this would lead to some government action. You have Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This is the one about the meatpacking industry, super gross. Basically talked about how there's really unsanitary conditions where meat is being packed, and you might have rats and bugs and all sorts of things in your meat and you don't even know about it. This led to the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act. Okay, so this did make a big change in the industry. You have Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus, and that's about the railroad industry. And this led to some of the monopolies in the railroad industry being broken up. Easy to remember the octopus because you think about the octopus has a ton of different tentacles and it's kind of like railroad lines across the United States. And then you have Lincoln Steffens, who wrote The Shame of the Cities. And this was essentially about how local city governments were super corrupt. You had the spoils system where people were putting their friends and family into power. And they were trying to make a change in how city governments were run. How did workers gain more rights and privileges through the courts? So this is when we talk about various court cases that protected workers' rights to unionize and other workers' rights and provided workers with safer and more fair working conditions. So 2 things that we had in 2 acts that we had pass through Congress were the Adamson Act. So that established a standard 8-hour workday. Before that, you could have people working 12, 15 hours at a time. And then the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. That made it legal for workers to organize into unions. And we know that unions are important in a lot of these industries because it gives people a voice. It, gets them all together under one main idea where they now have a voice to speak against kind of the things that are going wrong in that industry and the things that they need. Who wanted education and trade to be the way to improve Black lives? That's going to be W.E.B. Du Bois. So he wanted an end to social and political segregation. He promoted higher education, or college, for the top 10% of Americans and trade training for the rest. So he thought that, we didn't really need to have these laws that said that African Americans were the same or should be held in the same light under the law as white Americans. He didn't think that that was something that needed to be handled in the government. He thought that this was going to naturally fix itself if African Americans just got the education. So he thought that the top 10%, they need to go to college. The basically the smartest African Americans and the rest need to go to trade school. And then which amendment gave women the right to vote? This is the 19th Amendment. So this says that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So if you see things about women's suffrage, remember that suffrage is that right to vote. So we talk about women's suffrage. If it asks you any questions about, if I have a test that asks you any questions about women's suffrage, they're asking you about women's right to vote and the fight for that right to vote.